Okay. Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, everybody. My name is Nancy Varian, and I'm a lecturer at Middlesex University, Mauritius. And there's a photo of our campus on the right-hand side of the slides. And I'm a lecturer for the foundation program, but my title is lecturer in international education. And as Phil said, today my short talk will be on existential activities can amplify critical thinking when using generative AI. So I think it's important that I talk a little bit about Mauritius because it is a tiny island that sometimes gets omitted from world maps, or is just recognised as a honeymoon destination. So Mauritius is a small African island situated from the east coast of Madagascar, in the Indian Ocean, with a population of 1.2 million. So I've placed there's a flag there. It's the Mauritian flag, red, blue, yellow, green. And Middlesex University Mauritius is obviously in Mauritius, and it's an offshore British campus of Middlesex University in Hendon, London. So we began as an offshore campus in 2009. And in fact, next year we celebrate I think it's February, we celebrate our 15th birthday. So our campus is relatively small to another campus, which is in Dubai and in Hendon. So we have a population of 1,700 students, and the far majority of those students come from Anglophonic Eastern Africa and Asia. So students that decide to join our university, one of the big attraction is that it's a British education and a British certificate, and therefore the curriculum that we deliver is obviously from British higher education. And I think from last week and equally today, we're looking at critical thinking. And critical thinking is an essential component of the students' sets of competences, starting from the foundation program at level 3 up until doctoral level. Although we don't offer doctoral at the moment, it will be at postgraduate level. So critical thinking is at the heart and soul of every subject, because its concepts and its principles are presupposed and give rise to good thinking, and the logic of the subject, the program that they have enrolled on. And so within the term of critical thinking, students begin to hear terms such as critical thinking, critical analysis, critical awareness, critical consciousness, and critical reflection. And for many of the students from the countries I've explained they come from, it's possibly the first time they are hearing these terms, and beginning to recognize that it's a key skill that needs to be developed quite rapidly in their learning. And that also applies at the foundation level where I teach. And the foundation level is offered twice a year, and it's either 22 weeks in an academic year, or 24 or 24 weeks. And at our campus, we have pathway-driven foundation program, and the pathways are computer science, law, psychology, business, and advertising, public relations, and media. And students that do the foundation program will take 2 modules that are aligned with the pathway they have chosen. And there are 2 generic core modules. One is maths, and the other is critical thinking and independent learning skills. And so because we're looking at critical thinking, the module aim of critical thinking at the foundation level, and as it states on the slide, the module aims to develop fundamental independent learning, written and oral communication skills, critical thinking, and analysis skills, which are required to continue studying at degree level. students will be introduced to a high-level thinking skills through critical lateral thinking exercises, along with time management and independent learning skills. So how we begin to introduce our students to this module, and very early on, like I said, it's 22 or 24 weeks. So it starts from week 2 or 3 that we begin to introduce the idea, the concept, the necessity of critical thinking. And so the slide that you see in front is one of the slides that I would be using at Foundation, looking at questions starting with the who, the what, the where, the when, the why. And you can, if you can see in the box, there are some questions that will be using the who, the what, the where, the why, and the how. But to frame this concept for students who are beginning to understand critical thinking, it would be that this, if we look on the right-hand side, or my right-hand side, it would be looking at this, any given situation where we're trying to critically think about, critically reflect about, to assess it. What questions do you need to ask? And we would use the guide that's on the left-hand side. How would you begin to formulate a course of action? How would you evaluate that course of action? And I think it's been mentioned by my colleagues before, it's an iterative process. And so we would be repeating the 1 and the 2 and 3 until we get closer to an understanding of where we want to be or where we think we need to be. And that's quite a deep and complex process, and sometimes very heavy for students who perhaps are not accustomed to critical thinking, and especially from week 2. So we try to introduce, well, I try to introduce that in a lighter way. And so we begin with activities, and there's one here, very light-hearted, and it's also an opportunity for foundation students to get to know each other. And the activity to help that process of critical thinking is thinking out of the box. And so in small groups, students would be asked to call out random objects, and then within the groups that they formed in class, begin to think about how can we create an association with these 2 random objects. And so sky's the limit. It can be as creative and as wacky as they wish. And the purpose is, in a fun and engaging way, is to disentangle perhaps a more rote learning, procedural process of learning that they've had before in their education. And why do we do that? It's because very early on with the formative assignments as well as the summative assignments, this word pops up again, critical. The slide that you have in front is something that we would be using if we're looking at evaluating sources for a report or an annotated bibliography. So when reading, they would be asked to use their critical thinking skills to determine whether the resource would be helpful. And again, it's on the premise that students know what critical thinking is, assume that it's been developed and that they're able to apply it. And the reality is, for students, foundation students, and maybe for many students at Middlesex University, and maybe for international students who are studying at universities in different parts of the world, but particularly more in the UK, have come from a background where it's rote learning. And so the question and the challenge that I have is, I am working and teaching the vast majority of students who have come from an educational system where rote learning has been the premise of their academic achievement. And
you've got about a minute, Nancy.
Oh, okay. And so the skill is, how do we move from rote learning to critical thinking? And is it realistic that this can be done within a short period of time? So for my students, a quick route may be to use generative AI and to stay on track with completing their task because of not necessarily grasping critical thinking in such a short period of time, the paradigm shift. So existential activities, which is relating to the experience, which is much more intrinsic and profound, as opposed to experiential activities, which is derived from the experience, would be asking more profound questions such as, what am I doing when I'm using generative AI? Do I trust it? How is my learning changing? What is my relationship with generative AI? It's my secret friend. You know, it guides me, it helps me. I won't be able to tell people who it is. So what is my relationship? So I think very quickly, students want to pass and graduate. And in a short period of time, especially for my students, it's the paradigm shift from rote learning to critical thinking. And so I think that the push-pull factor for educators is that we worry about students having an over-reliance or being de-skilled by using generative AI, whereas students want to pass and graduate. And I think the way forward is to invite exploration through activities that cultivate and illuminate personal choices and responsibilities for the experiences they have. And that can be done through activities using AI, where they make personal connections that can amplify their critical thinking and a much more deeper consciousness. And just very quickly, the exercise that I did with my class was half were given an exercise and asked to complete it using Copilot. And once they finished, they would have a break. The other half had to use it without Copilot. And so it was inevitable those that used Copilot finished very quickly. But the difficulty and the challenge they had was when they were questioned on the assignment that they completed with Copilot, that they didn't have that depth of knowledge and understanding. They could bluff, but they didn't have that know-how. And so it's from that experience then students began to realize, how do they feel using generative AI or Copilot or whatever it may be, and how is that changing their learning? So I apologize for the short ending, but voila. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a great talk. And I do hate kind of rushing people at the end, but it helps to keep to time. So it was a really great talk. And if it's okay with you, Nancy, we'll circulate your slides afterwards so everyone can take a look at them.
Sure, no worries.
If you have a question for Nancy, if you'd like to raise your hand, we've got about 3 minutes. While that's going on, I have a question, if that's okay, Nancy. So,
sure.
In your experience, are there any kind of, and I'm thinking there probably are there any common challenges that you find that students face when first kind of reflecting on their values or their learning experiences or the process? And are there any kind of tips that you can maybe say about how you may help students to overcome those early on?
I think for our students, they're very respectful towards their educators. And so the purpose of critical thinking, you know, to question, to analyze, to challenge is quite difficult when they've had so much of their education being respecting the educator. And so suddenly, within 1 or 2 weeks, it's the complete flip. And that takes a very long time for students to make that transition, if at all. And so they can be perceived in the class as being very quiet or not engaging or don't have the answers. And it could be something very, very different. And it's also, I think it's no fault of their education. I think it's also the resources from where they come from that, you know, I've had students that come from classes where there's 100 in a class. Now, the educator may not have time for questioning. It's just delivering and making sure their students pass. So there are many factors that I think we need to consider when students come into the classroom that perhaps may not be so obvious, even though they've chosen to take on a British education. And I think that's where decolonizing education comes along. I think that's where we come into cultural diversity, and that's why I'm here today, to just give 15 minutes of a reflection from the African continent. And thank you for this opportunity, Phil.
Oh, and we're glad you've come along as well, Nancy, because it was a great talk, and we do try to include as many talks as possible. So I do encourage anyone who's kind of not within the UK or even Europe to submit talks, because we do consider everyone, and we would like to kind of increase the number of talks that we have from other countries. So I think it's really powerful. So we've now run to time, Nancy, but I knew there are some questions in both the chat and the Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind taking a look. If you do have to dash, we can send those over to you, and then maybe we can get a response at some stage. But thank you again for joining us. It's been great.
No worries. Thank you very much. Thank you.